organising this debate, and it's very nice to be back in Conway Hall. It has been a long time since I've been in Conway Hall. There never is much time, so I will get straight to the point. And this debate about whether Islam is compatible or reconcilable with Western society really comes down to one thing, to one primary question. What is Islam, and what do we mean by Islam? Because if we're going to decide this, we must know what we are talking about. So what is it? You may hear from the other side of this debate this evening, or from the other side of this debate generally, that Islam is whatever Muslims make it, that it is essentially subjective. But by very definition, this can't be true. People look to religion for guidance, for advice on how to live. Therefore, there must, by definition, be an objective source for people to turn to for that guidance. In the case of religions, the objective source is usually a core written scripture or the philosophy of its founder, or both. In short, Islam and Muslims are not the same thing. The follower and the guidance they follow cannot, by definition, be the same thing. And Muslims are human beings with all the complexities of human beings. They are the readers of the book, not the book itself. And many will interpret that book differently, but the book remains the same. It is objective. So if Islam is not Muslims, then what is it? And you may also hear from the other side of this debate that the Islam that I describe is not the true Islam, and that the true Islam is compatible with Western society. So what is true Islam? Islam is the Quran and Muhammad, or it's nothing. If Islam is not the Quran and Muhammad, then this pen is yellow. In other words, nothing has an objective reality. Everything is what we want it to be, but in reality it isn't. And this pen is black, not yellow, and the Islam is the Quran and Muhammad. And to understand then whether Islam is compatible with the West, you have to look to the Quran and Muhammad. And it's here that the interpretation dilemma begins. To get an idea of how Islam is interpreted by Islamic scholars, imams, and leaders of Islamic states the world over, we can use this to decide whether it is compatible with the West. And I'll briefly address what is meant by the West, and we all know what we mean by the West, especially in the context this evening. We mean freedoms, we mean religious and philosophical freedom, equal rights for all people before the law, science and reason, freedom of speech and expression. For our purposes tonight, that, I would argue, is what we mean by the West. And however imperfect the West may be, those freedoms there's still a light shining. Those still represent the West we are discussing. So let's see some examples of how Islam is interpreted by its scholars and its leaders. And there are 13 countries in the world that execute people for blasphemy and apostasy. And these are Muslim majority, and the death penalty is justified and sustained by reference to Islamic scripture by religious leaders. This is not the extreme fringe, it's the law of the land, and such laws have widespread public support in many nations, and largely, I would argue, because it is justified in Islamic scriptures. Now, the difference between religious freedom and death for blasphemy cannot be any more stark. They are each other's opposite. They are therefore entirely irreconcilable. There's no middle ground, it's one or the other. Equal treatment for all people before the law. And nowhere is this difference between Islam and the West seen more profoundly than in the status and treatment of women. And in the West, however imperfect we may be in practice, violence against women is a criminal offence, and a woman has the same social and political rights as a man. Now, in Islam, in both scripture and practice, this is far from the case. The Quran designates women to be inferior to men, and across the Muslim world, the mainstream, not the fringe, women are subject to forced marriage, child marriage, honour violence, and injustices, great injustices, such as their testimony being worth less than a man's, by the state. This is the treatment they receive by the state. It is a treatment of women that most Western women simply would find unfathomable. It is not, therefore, reconcilable with the concept of equal rights of all people before the law as we know it in Western democracies. And a further argument you may hear is, but not all Muslims behave like this, so therefore it can't be Islamic. It is Islamic. It is Islamic because it comes from the Islamic scriptures. And what moderate Muslim societies demonstrate is not a moderate form of Islam, but a distance from Islam. In other words, the more influence Islam has in a society, the fewer freedoms and rights can be found. So in summary, the question you're being asked this evening is, what is Islam? Is it the, with respect, wishful thinking of reform or moderate Muslims? Or is it the literal text of the Quran? Others are asking you to accept that Islam is what they say it is. I'm arguing that you should accept Islam as the Quran says it is. Not what I say it is, but as the Quran and the hadiths of Muhammad say it is. And what they say it is not, by any objective standard, reconcilable with Western freedoms as we understand them today. Thank you for your time.
Now, but is there something that can be reconciled over time? Emily?
Yeah, thank you. You took the words out of my mouth. There is a theological debate to be had, but we also have to have a debate about today. And the question I want to answer is whether Islam today is compatible. Not a theologian. I do know that Muhammad, the Quran, commands holy war against the unbeliever until all religion is for Allah. That is written in the Quran. And I know that Muhammad was a warrior and a warlord. We know this. He killed people. So Jesus did not do any of those. And I'm not religious. I have no horse in this race. But that is observable reality from reading the core texts of both of these religions. But even they're not alike. But even if they were, and as you have argued, some of the things are similar. We are living in 2017, and it's 2017 that matters. And the West we are talking about now doesn't take or use any terrible things that may be written in the Old Testament and place them into our laws today. There may be stoning in the Old Testament, but there is no stoning in Western society today, and that is what we are talking about. We are talking about the West, and it isn't compatible. It's been said that nobody has a monopoly on righteousness. Now, again, this is distraction. And it's the same distraction we see when we ignore Islam and start talking about how awful the West is. And how an accidental fire in London demonstrates how awful the West is. It's a distraction. It distracts us from looking at Islam, which is what we are here to talk about. And furthermore, nobody is saying that anyone has a monopoly on righteousness. I specified more than once that we are not perfect. Nobody is perfect, but that's not the question we're answering. We weren't here to answer the question, is any society perfect? We're here to answer whether Islam is compatible with Western society, and I believe that we've shown that it isn't. You said you don't think it's right to force people. Well, then you should surely be condemning the practice of Islam all over the world. It is perfect at forcing people. It imposes the death penalty on any complaint or any criticism. And finally, FGM. FGM is not an African practice. It is practiced in countries outside of Africa, including in Indonesia, where it is growing, and it is growing in other non-African countries as well. It is endorsed by the Muslim Brotherhood. When they took power in Egypt after the Arab Spring, it was a priority to them. They had mobile FGM units going around the country. It is also justified in almost everywhere it is practiced by Islamic clerics and defended as an Islamic practice, and the reason for that is that it does appear and is sanctioned in the Islamic hadiths. So those of us who know that fact, and if you want to see it, you look at the Islamic hadiths for yourself and see that they are sanctioned in there. Not all Muslims do it because not all Muslims accept those hadiths. That doesn't mean they're not there, and that doesn't mean they're not the reason that Islamic clerics can continue to sustain FGM the world over. The question is, once again, is Islam compatible with the West? The answer is clearly no.
To one side for a second, you would acknowledge the change in Judaism. As you said, Muhammad was arguing that there is room for an already nascent change of that kind in Islam. Anne-Marie, what do you think about this? From your perspective, which is very different from ours.
Okay. I'm going to have to be the one to bring it back into 2017 again, because in all honesty, someone has to. Look, we've heard that we need to learn from the horrible parts in our own scripture and move on from it. The fact of the matter is that we in the West, we have done that. We have learned from our own scriptures and moved on from it. But Islam hasn't, and much of the Muslim world hasn't. Now, this is the difference between us. This is the difference between us. And again, I keep hearing, no matter how many times Alan has demonstrated it, or myself, or people in the audience, that there's no difference between Islam and Christianity. There is a difference between Islam and Christianity, yet we keep hearing there's not. There are fundamental differences that have an impact, a real impact in the world today. One of those, as Alan has mentioned, is child marriage. It is accepted in the hadith that Muhammad married a 6-year-old and raped her when she was 9. Now, this is directly responsible for the rape and forced marriage of young girls in the world today. This is the issue. This is what we need to be talking about. And I'm not sure why a discussion on political correctness and wedding cakes or science labs answers the question whether Islam is compatible with the West or not. It just shows a sort of instinct to, when asked to compare the two, the instinct is to attack the West. And I agree with the point on political correctness. We are losing our freedom of speech, and we're losing it for two reasons: political correctness and Islam, which of course are completely linked and completely intertwined. However, having said all that, I mentioned when I spoke the 13 countries in the world that execute people for blasphemy and apostasy, all Islamic, and the Western countries that execute people for blasphemy and apostasy is 0. These are profound differences. They are differences that exist today when it matters. And with all the theology going on, I'll keep being the one to remind people that we have irreconcilable differences between the Islam of 2017 and the West of 2017.
The first point was on British Islam, which is effectively what Mohammed started talking about. And what the recent question suggests, maybe there isn't a difference between Islam in this country, Islam elsewhere. Is there a way of getting a reconcilable British Islam?
Anything is possible. But again, I'm going to have to bring it back to reality. In theory, probably, if you abandon many of the verses of the Quran and disown many of the hadiths. But let's look at how it works in the real world. There are reformers, people like Ayan Hirsi Ali, for example, and others, Nani Darwish, and we see their lives. They live their lives with death threats. Their lives are in danger. They are consistently demonized by other Muslims or by Muslims, and of course by the left. So where do you begin if you're going to reform Islam or reform Sharia to make it more compatible? Where do you begin when you are not able to criticize Muhammad? How can you possibly reform Islam if you can't criticize Muhammad? How can you possibly reform Islam if you can't criticize the Quran? Because it puts your life in danger. This is the reality. So there are those, as I say, who are trying to reform, but they are despised widely. And I would agree with the lady in the front here. Indeed, it's the most important argument, I think, that's been made tonight. Even if Islam and Sharia are to reform, it should not do so in the West, because we have already had religious wars, we have already lived through a dark age, and I don't want us to live through another one. We have no obligation whatsoever to host this reform of Islam, and you're right, it will take generations and generations. I want to finally take issue with the notion that most of the victims are Muslims. Well, the Quran condemns non-Muslims page after page after page. It is required, our subjugation is required in the core scriptures of Islam. And in the last couple of years, the slaughter of people all over Europe by jihadi terrorists means that Muslims are certainly not the only victims, although they are often the only ones spoken about. Anish, I think you can guess what I think of those groups. But the most alarming and worrying thing about those groups, they're just talking Islam. As you say, and what I said in my speech is that Islam is Islam. What's different is Muslims, not Islam. And it's the same Islam here as it is elsewhere in the world. The only difference is the practice and what people are allowed to practice, what the law of the land allows them to practice. Muslims vary, Islam does not. But what's most alarming about those groups that you mention, Anish, is how they are promoted, sanitized, not just by the loony left, but by the British state, by having anything to do with numerous groups, the Muslim Council of Britain and all the other ones you've described. MEND has again been defended by members of Parliament recently, if I remember correctly. These people are promoting Sharia law. They are promoting the complete destruction of our freedom, our society, to be replaced by a brutal religious tyranny. And they're being supported in it. And the most important thing we can do in response to that, the most important way to defend ourselves in response to that, is to stop apologizing, stop what-a-routery, stop distracting ourselves, and start looking at what that text actually says. That's the starting point. Only then can we hope to reform it. But even if it does reform, I don't want it reforming here. Thank you. With respect, only this side has actually answered the question this evening. Alan has given a theological response, I've given us a real-world response. But we're the only ones, this is the only side who've actually answered the question. We've been told what the similarities are between various religious traditions. This was not the question. The question wasn't what have religions got in common. The question was what are if there are irreconcilable differences between Islam and the West. We have shown over and over again, myself and Alan, that it is completely irreconcilable, both in theory and in practice and in everyday reality. And once again, no matter how clear I try to make it, the point still does not seem to be getting home. The difference between Islam and Muslims. What you're talking about when you talk about you're a Muslim and so is the leader of ISIS, once again, you're talking about Muslims. I am talking about Islam. The question is about Islam. And I went to great lengths to make the distinction between Islam and Muslims, and yet still the same argument is coming back. On the other hand, we have been told that the problem is, of course, the West. Of course it's the West. We're asked essentially to compare the two, and the only criticism goes for the West, even though we have shown that there are greater freedoms, far greater freedoms in the West than there is in the Muslim world. And no West bashing is complete without, of course, bringing up colonialism or the Holocaust, or trying to imply that our side is arguing that the West is perfect. We're not. We're arguing that it's not compatible with Islam. And I have to make this point because it happens all the time, that the horrors that occur in the name of Islam are somehow the result of Western interference, geopolitical Western interference in Muslim countries. Now that you may have a case there if you were talking about jihadi terror. They certainly do use Western actions as ammunition to recruit for jihadi terror. And no one here is saying, I'm certainly not, that the West is a saint. But there is absolutely no argument to make that the West is in any way responsible for the fact that Saudi Arabia chops off the heads of its own people for blasphemy and apostasy. That is not, can never be the result of Western interference in anything. It is the result of the religion that informs and creates and sustains the brutal legal system in that country. It is religion, it's coming from the religion, it has nothing to do with Western actions. This again is whataboutery and distraction to keep us away from the issue at hand. Will it reform in the West? It's probably the best chance. It's probably the best chance, and yes, Muslim immigration will have to stop for that to happen. But how can it reform in the West when our entire social structure, our political structure, our media panders to the very, very worst of Muslim opinion in this country? We pander at every turn. Meanwhile, we turn our backs on ex-Muslims and reform Muslims and cower down and suck up to jihadi groups or jihadis in ties, a suit and tie jihad that has ridiculous amounts of praise and defence not only by our establishment, but across the left. It won't even reform in the West while this apologism continues, while we continue to preach how Islam is a religion of peace. It comes out of everywhere, every leader, religious and political leader. There will be no reform in the West either until we stop pandering, stop pussyfooting, stop pretending that Islam is anything but Islam, and that the horrors that come from Islam have everything to do with Islam. Until that happens, there'll be no reform in the West or anywhere else. So, in answer to the question, I think we have proven beyond any real doubt that there is no reconciling core Islamic notions and beliefs with what we know today as Western freedoms. They are irreconcilable. Thank you.
We will make America great again.